As far as the costs of inflation are concerned, we will broadly divide it into anticipated inflation and unanticipated inflation. Assuming that inflation was anticipated to be 4%, notwithstanding the fact that inflation is anticipated, still there are some costs associated with inflation. What is known as the menu cost. The menu cost is one of the costs associated with anticipated inflation because notwithstanding the fact that inflation was anticipated, the very fact that prices are rising requires companies or sellers to post the new prices or inform the consumers about the new prices by printing new catalogs, new menu cards. Printing those catalogs, printing those menu cards involves money, and which is a cost arising because of the fact that prices are rising and it needs to be conveyed to the consumers. So this cost is called the menu cost. Menu costs arise because the sellers or the producers have to inform the consumers about the new prices in the face of inflation. Because there is inflation, prices are rising, and new prices, the increased prices, need to be conveyed to the consumer through either you send a mail, or you print a catalog, or you print or you paste new labels. Whatever you do, it costs in terms of time and money, and this is a cost associated with an inflation rate which is perfectly anticipated. Another kind of cost is associated with anticipated inflation in addition to the menu cost. That cost is known as the shoe leather cost of inflation, and the shoe leather cost of inflation arises because there is an opportunity cost of holding money or the liquid cash. Now, as we all know, an individual has a choice either to keep liquid money with him or to keep the money with the bank, so that and if he keeps the money with the bank, he earns an interest. So given an opportunity, an individual would like to keep the least possible cash with him to meet the day-to-day transactions, and would like to keep the maximum money within a bank so as to earn the interest banks offer on savings bank deposits. Now, when inflation is there, and prices are rising at a particular rate, say 4%, 5%, now you find that the money that you have kept with you in ready cash form to carry out day-to-day transactions or becomes inadequate, and that requires you to withdraw money from the bank. And withdrawing money from the bank is not a costless affair. Either you have to spend time, or if you are withdrawing money electronically, then you have to spend time. If you are doing a physical transaction, you have to travel to the bank that and withdraw money, and that involves time as well as cost. And all these costs are termed as the shoe leather cost of inflation. Because of inflation, you were required to incur certain costs which otherwise you would not have required to make. Now we will move to the the costs associated with unanticipated inflation. When I say unanticipated inflation, suppose RBI has announced that it is targeting for a 4% inflation rate, but the actual inflation, because it was a monsoon failure or it was a miscalculation of the demand stimulus in the economy, the actual inflation turned out to be suppose 7%. Now, with a 7% inflation, this is when people were expecting 4% inflation, actual inflation turning out to be 7% involves a number of costs on the economy. Let us see what they are. First, inflation, which is unanticipated, causes a redistribution of wealth, or redistribution of income within the economy. What happens when somebody is lending money? You are expecting not only a real return for foregoing your consumption, present consumption, and whenever you are lending money, you want a return for deferring your consumption to a future date, and also you want to be compensated for inflation. Now suppose you wanted a 3% return for deferring your consumption, which we call as the real return, but you also expect a 4% inflation. So you wanted a 7% return, and that is the rate at which you have lent money to somebody who was in need of money. Now when you get back money at the end of 1 year at 7 with a 7% return, you are finding the inflation itself is 7%. So your real return is actually zero. That means you did not get anything for waiting for 1 year to to make use of that money which you had given. Now who has gained in the process? We find that the lender who has lent the money, he has been the sufferer, but the borrower has has gained in the process, because if the real cost of availing funds were 3%, and if inflation were expected at 7%, the borrower would have paid a 10% rate of interest, but in effect he has paid 7% rate of interest because inflation was anticipated to be 4%, but it turned out to be 7%. In a way, the borrower has gained by 3%, whereas the lender has lost by 3%. Now in effect, what is happening is that somebody is gaining at the expense of somebody else, and in this example we found that the borrower has benefited when inflation turns out to be more than what was anticipated, whereas the lender has lost out. But in totality, it is a zero-sum game, and when we say it is a zero-sum game, we want to convey that one party in the transaction gains at the cost of the other. So there is no, it is not the case that both parties in a transaction benefited. There are many instances of zero-sum game which we will discuss as we proceed, but for the time being, one of the costs of unanticipated inflation can be explained through the fact that inflation is a zero-sum game where one party, the borrowers, benefit at the cost of the lenders. What are the other costs associated with unanticipated inflation? Another cost associated with unanticipated inflation is the uncertainty it creates in the minds of investors. Now, when you are planning to make an investment in the sense we have described, that you want to build a factory, or you want to import a new machinery, or you want to induct a sophisticated technology into your factory, all these things would be affected when there is unanticipated inflation. And if in the recent past inflation has been behaving erratically, people would not like to commit themselves to long-term investment because they do not know how the inflationary situation will pan out. Why inflation creates uncertainty for investors and may lead to a deferment of investment in the economy? Because we find that nominal interest rates sooner or later get adjusted to the inflationary situation in the economy. So if inflation is if inflation is expected to be on the higher side, one would expect that nominal interest rates should be higher. And when somebody is making an investment on by taking a loan or on borrowed funds of the bank, now the investor knows that if it is going to be high inflation, then naturally the cost of servicing the loan is going to be very high. And in such a scenario, when you expect the cost of your borrowings to increase significantly, it would not be prudent on part of investors to commit themselves to new investments. So what we find is that in periods of high and uncertain inflation or unanticipated inflation, the investors would like to play safe and would not like to take up new investment plans. They would like the dust to settle, as they say, and before committing new funds into fresh investments. And this is a real cost, and the economy may have to pay in terms of sacrificing good amount of growth in the process. And sometimes what happens when inflation is there, um, policy measures are used to bring it to the more desirable level or to the more acceptable level, but in the process the central bank may increase rates, which may discourage new investments, while some inflation may be needed as it acts as an incentive for producers to expand production when they find that the prices of their products are rising. And that is why it is often said that inflation greases the wheels of the economy, but only a moderate inflation, a lower level of inflation at an acceptable level, and in the Indian context we have discussed it is around 4%. Now, when inflation is higher than the acceptable level, it leads to policy measures, and sometimes the policy measures which are enacted to control inflation may lead to a hard landing of the economy. We will discuss about hard landing, the characteristics of hard landing when we discuss business cycles. But for the time being, it would be sufficient to say that sometimes policy measures used to control inflation leads to very high interest rates, and in the process in new investments are discouraged. Discretionary consumption is also adversely affected, which may bring down the growth rate in the economy. And as we all know, when growth rate declines, it is a matter of worry for all. So broadly, we are talking about two things primarily. One is it leads to a redistribution of income in the economy. It leads to inflation, unanticipated inflation leads to deferment of new investments in the economy. It can also affect discretionary consumption in the economy. And another cost of inflation could be the social dimension of it, and this relates to the issue of indexation. And we know that when people's incomes are indexed to inflation, they are immune from some of the ill effects of inflation. But in an economy like India, where hardly 15 to 18% of the labor force income is indexed to inflation, for the rest of or the bulk of the population where the income is not indexed to inflation, when inflation is there, it really affects the purchasing power of a larger segment of the population. And that is why it is often said that inflation hurts the poor more than the rich, because generally the poor do not have a source of income which is indexed to inflation. Here, I would also like to discuss a few concepts related to inflation. One is the core inflation, and another is the threshold inflation. Now, coming to core inflation is nothing but inflation measured using an exclusion principle. What do I mean by that? Generally, we said, say, the WPI, which is measured using 697 commodities prices. Now, suppose we are measuring WPI at and suppose the central bank says they are committed to a WPI of say 5%, but in effect we find WPI turns out to be 8%. Now the central bank gets the blame that it has not been able to control inflation. Now it may so happen that the inflation has come about from the increase in prices of fuel products, or especially the oil prices have increased sharply, and that is what is reflected in a much higher inflation number. Now the oil prices depends on the import price of oil, and the import price of oil depends on so many geopolitical factors. When prices rise because of forces which are beyond the control of the government or the central bank, The central bank often takes a stance that don't judge me about my performance in controlling inflation by looking at the headline inflation or the overall inflation number, but look at the inflation number taking out those components which are more volatile, whose prices are decided by forces outside the economy, like import prices. So when we apply an exclusion principle, take away certain commodities from the basket of goods that we are tracking, then we will get what is known as the core inflation. Now, when we are talking about the core CPI or the core WPI, it is measured by tracking a subset of the of goods from the entire basket of goods, and we exclude certain goods whose prices are beyond the control of the government or the central bank.